Hi everyone, welcome to this episode 190. Very special episode today. Dave and I will be discussing, I want to say, our plans for the next year, but also recapping some of the learnings, some of the projects, and some of the opportunities from the last year. I see Dave has a slightly puzzled look on his face, so I'm not sure if that's because something is technically wrong or am I saying something that is a little bit different than planned. But anyhow, I am assuming that the stream is recording, so there will definitely be a technical backup if anything on the technical side is not working correctly. So that is going to be the plan for this stream today. We will be having a couple of streams that will be broadcasted on the usual platforms of some of the events that we had filmed at ICC and or potentially some of the automate stuff which we've actually published on our YouTube channel. And this is, I guess, the reminder that I will give you is we typically broadcast to two main platforms, that is LinkedIn as well as YouTube. We also broadcast to a few other platforms through the platform that we're using on the back end, and those are going to be your Facebook as well as Twitter. So if you do want to follow us on the live shows, that's going to be on LinkedIn as well as YouTube. And if you want to obviously catch us on the recording side, you can go there, or you can also listen to us in audio form after the episodes have been processed, which currently has a delay of a couple of weeks, and that's going to be on your podcast platform. So that's everything from Apple to I believe Google has completely shut down their platform now. So it's on not Shopify. What's the platform?
Spotify.
Spotify. That's right,
It's
Spotify.
on all your normal podcast platforms.
That's right. That's right. So in any case, Dave, let's get into the recap of 2024. What have your thoughts been? What have been some of the takeaways, interesting project, etc., etc.
Absolutely. I will say for Vlad and all of our listeners, you actually seemed much more confused as to exactly what to say at the very beginning of the show, as you were welcoming all of our guests in, and that was the confusion on my face. We are live with
Um,
everyone. We can see some folks are coming in. Hi to everyone coming in. If I will say, because Vlad did not say, if you guys have questions or comments, please feel free to go ahead and throw them in the comments in the chat. We are happy to go ahead and chat with you guys, especially this episode, this theme of all of our themes. Having said that, I've got a bunch of thoughts. I'll give kind of some thoughts on Manufacturing Hub. You and I can go back and forth perhaps on that a little bit, Vlad, and then we can go give some thoughts on the rest of the industry. So overall, I was looking, we had about 50 episodes this year. We'll have a couple or three or four or five more come out during and over the break. And so I thought it was a really good year. I feel like we continue to have better conversations year and year. And I hope that all of our listeners are enjoying the conversations that we get to have, especially as we have shifted a little bit over the last couple of years from the first 2 years. I mean, this is end of year, I think, four for us here on the show. And I feel like this year we have gone and done more live shows. We've done a couple of more kind of intros to shows and post show recaps and things like that. I feel like I have fun doing that. We'll let Vlad throw his comments in there. I hope you guys are having fun enjoying that. I know that, especially when Vlad and I aren't at live shows, there can certainly be some of that FOMO of seeing a whole bunch of fun pictures and all of the other outings that everyone gets to do. So I certainly hope that everyone who gets to watch some of our live content or recorded content from the shows gets to go experience that a little bit, which has absolutely always been our goal. But no, overall, I think it was a lot of fun. I think we're going to double down on some of these in 2025. I want to go throw it over to you, Vlad. Do you have any kind of high level topics on Manufacturing Hub, things that you like, things that you didn't like? Were there enough snacks?
there definitely were enough snacks, especially at ICC and Automate this year. I think, look, high level, obviously, we are currently planning for next year. I think we have a lot of interesting shows, conversations, and themes lined up. And I think we'll get into that in a couple of bullet points. But ultimately, I think that, and we actually had this conversation with a potential sponsor, which whom I will not name. But ultimately, I think that people go into, let's say, content or podcasts specifically, And I think, within a certain number of episodes, you get this feeling of, this is harder than I expected, right? And usually you realize that because of, the back end work that it involves, the editing, the processing, the making sure the guests are there, the lining up some of the live events. And I think it becomes increasingly more daunting the more you do it, but ultimately there's kind of this hump, right? Which I think we're definitely over, where you're like, well, like things are actually pretty good. We get some, recognition in the space, and we get to have very interesting conversations from which, not only our listeners learn, but we also learn a lot about the industry, right? And I'll give as an example, I was listening to the cybersecurity that we had not too long ago, and to be honest with you, it's super interesting to learn about how companies do things. You learn a lot about compliance, regulations. So I think again we've crossed that barrier. I think several years ago.
Mhm.
So I am looking forward to 2025 on that side.
Absolutely. I will go double down and say that I also really do and appreciate the learning and education. I feel like the exposure that Vlad and I get, and hopefully everyone who's watching this gets, is valuable to your everyday life. I probably wouldn't know about half of the cool pieces of technology that we get to go talk to different experts about if they didn't exist, and if we didn't have this being able to go ahead and talk to them. Yeah, kind of all across the board. For me, I'd say 2024 was a ton of fun, right? So I got to, as you guys probably saw, I was in Germany for about 3 weeks over the period of two different trips, mostly unintentionally two trips, but over the course of two trips at the spring of this year, I got to spend a bunch of time, mostly around, excuse me, mostly around southern Germany, and go spend some time there in Bavaria, going and working with some clients and visiting a bunch of friends and other people who I have known from mostly trade shows. And it was really nice to be able to go spend time on campuses, at facilities in the manufacturing areas, or just in some offices, and have a significantly less stressful conversation than, hey, we need to go do all of these things and we have to go do them all in 20 minutes because everyone is booked every 20 minutes. So that was a ton of fun. I got to learn a bunch of great things, meet a ton of fantastic people. And so that was amazing. On my side, I did a bunch of really interesting projects, right? I feel like Vlad and I don't spend a lot of time talking about projects on this show. And I think for 2025, and we'll talk about some of those things, but I think that's one of those things that we want to talk a little bit more about. And I think it's really fun and important to go attempt to go find projects that we can go share the adventure along the way, because at the end of the day, being able to go talk about a super white labeled project, or being able to go, share a case study at the end of it, isn't nearly as much fun as going and digging into some of the details, especially some of the technical details, as we always love to do with our guests. And so we certainly hope to spend more time doing that in 2025. I will say I've been doing, I guess historically, I've done a bunch of ignition work. I've done a fair amount of ignition work last year and then this year. And I certainly project to, as we'll talk about more later, continue to grow that practice and continue to grow that more into 2025 and beyond. So we've had a couple of those projects that were good, and what I continue to see, as Vlad and I have talked about, I don't know, probably incessantly on this show, is the fact that just going and doing some amount of development, or just going and deploying, one particular solution, very rarely solves a problem at a facility. And so the projects that I've been working on this year and working towards for 2025 and beyond are projects that, how can we go help on the engineering or operations side, which will lead us to go build very specific, very good digital projects, which will lead us to go continue to help on the engineering and operations side. And so that, for me, as I'll talk about more, is really something that I have been focusing on going into this year, and then we'll continue to focus on going into next year. And then beyond that, I would say kind of a high level conversation, a conversation that I've probably had, I don't know, Vlad, like 6 or 8 times this quarter, is groups of people who are looking for more automation, and not just, hey, I need this robotic cell, or I need this cobot, or I need this SCADA. or we need to go replace this HMI. It's groups who are looking to, for a variety of reasons that we can either choose to get into or not into, as we only have 75-ish minutes of this conversation, that they're looking to automate sometimes for the first time. And lots of times it's because they don't have the humans in order to go do it, right? Like if I could go hire 100 humans, I would just go spend the labor expenses to go hire the 100 humans, as opposed to go through the OPEX and CAPEX expenses to go do some of this automation. And what I find is that lots of those groups are looking for help, not just kind of on that one particular piece, but they're looking for help basically starting from the strategy side, right? It's hey, we have this problem, we know we need to automate, and this is about as far as we are. And so for me, from my perspective, I think it's really interesting that, for the longest time, especially like on the robots cobots, we've talked about how there are tens or hundreds of thousands of them in automotive manufacturing. And that is something that, that is something that, we've been doing for decades. But there's lots of groups who are going and looking to do that for the first time, right? And going to do that for the first time, there is 100 or 1,000 or more of these different things that we need to look at and understand, because when we go start pulling a couple of specific levers, it kind of changes the entire complexity of the organization of the problem. And then there's the whole operational and change management side, which is we need to go show our employees we're doing this to go make their lives easier, as opposed to we're doing this because we want to replace them. And I think there's certainly a lot of fear of, hey, you're bringing in robots to replace the humans. If they only knew we're bringing in robots and we're going to need them even more than ever before, they might feel a bit more comfortable. But I think it's just a cycle. And so I think we are seeing more and more of these groups, especially older legacy groups that have been around for decades, getting to the point of being forced into automation and digitalizing a lot of the work that they've done just with internal knowledge over the years.
Yeah, I mean, look, I have a slightly maybe different perspective on that last point, right? And I think that might even like bring our conversation into a different direction. But ultimately, from what I've seen, there's certainly a lot of conversations around not replacing humans.
Hmm.
But at least the projects I've seen in larger organizations is that it's very easy to justify a project based on how much human capital you're going to remove, right?
Hmm.
What I mean by that is if you have four operators on the line and you can showcase that you can automate to the point that removes, let's say, two of them, you
Hmm.
can very easily calculate, well, how much money is saved, therefore how much money can be allocated towards that automation project. So I think that there's a difference between what people are sometimes saying versus what happens in reality. So I wouldn't
Hmm.
necessarily say that it's always the case that we want to help those people keep the jobs. I think there's still
Hmm.
a lot of, how would I say it? There's a lot of easier ways to justify spending the budget if you can show that you can replace, humans with automation. And I think at least that's the reality that I've seen. But that's my comment on that.
Absolutely. I guess I would certainly agree with that. We certainly had a number of those conversations as well. And I shouldn't say, and I don't want to come across as, robots will not replace humans or automation will not replace humans or operators on the line. That to a large extent will happen. I think I first see the wave of where reducing the need of additional labor. Before we look at
Sure.
actually starting to remove jobs for again, lots, not every group, but lots of the groups that I discuss with, the being forced to go automate, especially in these like medium-sized organizations, is because they can't get the labor force, and they've tried to go down the labor force route and they failed for a number of reasons, mostly because it's really, really difficult, if at all possible, to go just throw more human capital at lots of these problems. And because they've gone down that road, that brings them to go through the process of automation. So yes, I certainly agree with it. But I've also had conversations where people are very candid of they're looking to go bring in this new technology. And I feel like those are lots of like the artificial intelligence conversations I've had this year, Vlad, is people are like, hey, I want to go do this on the AI side, and it's really easy for me to go spend X number of hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars if I can go show the return on investment by reduced headcount. That is certainly there. There are certainly those conversations that are being had. I was specifically talking to kind of companies who historically have not looked at that, or that wasn't a need or an option or a want, being forced to go down this route of looking at these options for a variety of the outside pressures.
Yeah. I'm not gonna make a comment on that I guess, discussion. So let me just maybe go through the recap of 2024 for me, because I know that will take us in a whole different conversation. I know there's a lot of discussions going on around AI. I have a ton of questions on that side, but look, all right. So on my side, 2024, right, and some of the listeners slash viewers know this, some probably don't. I 2.5 years ago decided to go on a venture on the IT slash DevOps side, which is called Kernel. You can find it on my profile if you're curious. It is still a company that is operating, which again is very different from my roots on the OT side.
Mm-hmm.
But after talking to many individuals, right, I think that the takeaways, if nothing else, made me a much stronger person going back to OT. Which again, I this is something I've decided a couple of months ago. Left on very good terms with the
Mm-hmm.
founders. Some of them are my childhood friends, and so ultimately I guess this year has been a retransition for me from, and I always maintain a presence on Solus PLC, on Manufacturing Hub, but ultimately, having raised quite a bit of money on the IT company, it did take up a lot of my attention, right? And so, as I've said a couple of months ago, I've decided to come back to OT and manufacturing. And so for me, I guess like I had relabeled the segment not only a recap but also maybe
Mm-hmm.
takeaways from
Mm-hmm.
2024. A couple of points on that side, right? So I think that number one, and this is again, this was someone as a mentor that mentioned this to me. He told me, like, building a business is extremely difficult, right? So anyone who steps outside and actually gets even someone to pay $1 for their idea is miles ahead for from someone who's maybe just pursuing a an employee type of relationship, because it is extremely difficult to build and sell something that you have essentially created from nothing. So I take that, I guess, as a compliment from that person, and it certainly
Mm-hmm.
has been a huge learning point for 2024. I have, you know, not decided which route to go yet for 2025, but I certainly am still very interested in building out a business, in which we'll get into a different section. uh, Picking out the right founders, I think, is extremely important in any conversations. I've already had, individuals reach out to me on different topics. I think being selective with the people that you work with is extremely important, right? And to me, that obviously goes on both technical and business sides. I think that I've realized, Dave, in many aspects, that I think you need to have a foundation in both in order to be effective, even in in what we're doing. Because if you don't have a fundamental understanding of, let's say, in manufacturing, of data, how it flows, how the architectures are, edge devices, cloud, and how they typically operate, again, it doesn't have to be to a granular detail. It is important to be able to have those conversations, and the same applies for the business side, right? If you want to start a business, if you're working on anything in manufacturing or in software or tech for that matter, you need to understand foundational principles of, I say business, but ultimately finances, accounting, general like principles, how things are purchased, how money is made, and how money is transferred for different initiatives. So for me, 2024 has been a huge learning process on all fronts. I'll also throw in, the aspect of sales. I think that, being an engineer, it's look, the truth is, I think that a lot of engineers despise salespeople until they actually are put in a position where they have to sell something, and then they gain an appreciation for what it truly takes, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so ultimately, and this is maybe a career advice ahead of the career advice. I think that if you can put yourself in a position where you sell something, right? Obviously, depending on your age, maybe it's even getting a job at a car dealership. But ultimately, if you're in a tech position, maybe or a bit more senior, then selling doesn't necessarily mean that you're just selling a product. You're always either selling yourself or selling your services, or trying to get, let's say, a better project within your company or a better role within your company. So all of it is sales. So that has been a
Mhm.
huge learning point for me for 2024. And in terms of, again, the last since, I guess, leaving Kerno, I am, you know I guess, knocking on all doors, building out pipelines on the sales side, on the marketing side, uh, applying to different, I want to say, like, technical initiatives. Again, we'll get into that for 2025, but ultimately, a lot of things need to be done to build that foundation. So that is what 2024 has been for me.
Absolutely. And if I can just add to what you're saying, Vlad, I, having been, I don't know, I suppose mostly in the background of your Kerno journey, I have found it really interesting, all of the IT stuff, kind of IT focused items that you've been working on over the last couple of years and how that relates to a lot of what we're seeing here on the manufacturing side. There's certainly been more than one time where you've seen something and you're like, yes, this is just super normal, or this is Kubernetes, or this is, kind of very normal things that literally everyone who is an IT person goes and speaks and knows. And so I think that was certainly a very interesting perspective that you've been able to pick up, and some additional technical skills outside of the OT technical skills that I can only imagine will continue to provide value for the projects you do. And then to your point of picking founders, I certainly agree, right? Like it to a large extent is you're marrying this person, right? You're probably going to spend more time working with them on things than the person that you are married to, because you're probably going to spend 8 to 10 hours, 5 or 7 days a week for however long this goes. And I know that I, perhaps in the past, have been more willing to jump into unknowns in different situations than I certainly am now, just because of outcomes of some of those things. And for one, really want to know a person that I'm going to go jump into any business venture with. And if they're someone who isn't giving back the same or the correct energy, especially like when we go to sit down to have some of these in-person conversations, or they're just super flaky, then it's like, I would
Yep.
love to do this. You're probably the right person to do it with, but we are not the correct matches. And so, certainly making sure and spending that extra time up front before you have signed documents and have all of these agreements, and you have intermingled funds and businesses and all of those things, taking more of that time up front. I feel like we hear lots of the success stories, but we very rarely hear about the time that you had to go kick a founder out, or the time that a founder left you high and dry, or the time that one of the partners just disappeared for 6 weeks and didn't say anything and then came back and they're like, yeah, everything's completely normal, right? Like, I don't know why you guys are upset that I've just not talked to you in a month and a half, right? So I think we hear lots of the positives. We don't hear very many of the negatives. So I think that is a very good point. I want to go shift to some manufacturing hub plans, because we are ahead of the curve. Well, we're certainly ahead of where we've ever been before in the past. So we have a bit of a shift in format. We have some themes that we're working on. We've got some trade shows and other things that we're working on. What do you want to talk about first, Vlad?
I think let's start with, I guess, the first shift, right, in format, and I can maybe take a stab at it really quickly. So ultimately, I think that Dave and I have always discussed manufacturing as being sort of the secondary thing that we do beyond what we are occupied on the day-to-day basis, right? I think it was never our intent, even from the beginning, to make this a full-time gig where, you and I either have these conversations every single day and then travel to trade shows on a multiple times a year. And so what that has, I guess, it created in a general sense, right? And when we talk to different groups, I think that the impression that they may sometimes get, despite us reiterating that point, is that Dave and I are podcasters, right? And
Mhm.
so we want to make sure that ultimately we're not only having conversations for the sake of having conversations, but we can also add some value based on our experience, right? And granted, we're not experts in every single domain that we bring our guests in. I think that Dave and I have both experience across like different verticals and different companies and different sizes of manufacturers that we can intelligently speak to almost every subject, at least to a certain extent. So
Mhm.
what we've decided to do in 2025 is we're going to have certain conversations with guests, and then there's going to be typically, we've scheduled once a month. It will be adjusted plus or minus depending on how we feel, where we can get to essentially review maybe based on the conversations we've had that month, or maybe just have a discussion on that specific topic between Dave and I, and ultimately also add some of our own, I want to say, not only opinions, right, but essentially factual information that we have researched and have knowledge
Mhm.
of on top of the conversations we've had and our experience. So that's going to be a shift in the format. And once again, just as we've done before, it's not going to impact your ability to ask questions. So you can also come and chat either on LinkedIn or YouTube, ask us questions about what we're having a conversation about. And to be honest with you, I would welcome people to challenge maybe some of our opinions or maybe advice and bring in, I don't want to say contrarian points for the sake of being contrarian, but maybe there's aspects where we can also learn and understand better that we didn't know about necessarily. So I think it's going to be a discussion ultimately between Dave and I on the
Mhm.
show. But if you have interesting questions or interesting points, definitely happy to get into those as well in those specific podcast sessions.
Absolutely.
But yeah,
So I'm certainly excited to go share a bit more of the projects that we've done, the projects that we're doing, to go share as much of that real world experience as Vlad and I possibly can. So we are excited to go ahead and do and share and showcase some of that. And again, our thought is still normal format, still basically every Wednesday. The major difference being once a theme, Vlad and I will come on without a guest to go have some of these conversations. I know that there's some of my favorite conversations, especially with the comments and everything else that we get from you guys here in the chat, so we can go kind of share some of our thoughts. So, talking about themes, we are going to end up doing somewhere between 8 and 9, 8 and 10 themes next year. It will generally be once a month, but we're going to give ourselves a little bit of time in there for trade shows and other things that we're doing so we can focus more on the specific shows and other things that we're at. And maybe if it's a big show, we do a preview show, and then something from the show floor, things along those lines. So I'm going to go ahead and share with everyone what we are currently thinking. We'll go ahead and share them in show notes and comments and other things if you guys are listening and want to actually read them. So we are gonna kick off the year with like a training and upskilling theme. So talking about all sorts of different training. I'm sure it'll be digital training. I'm sure it will be in-person training. We'll probably go and cover and touch a few different verticals, maybe how some organizations do it internally versus externally. We're going to do a digital transformation and industry 4.0 theme. Vlad is super excited about that. And I think we've agreed that we are going to have only practical applications when it comes to that, or as many practical applications as possible. I want to go dive, and this is a Dave theme, in some sort of modern maintenance practices, right? I feel like we talk about
was that
all
a
of these
Dave
super,
theme? I used to be a maintenance
because I
man.
came up with the theme, Vlad.
Oh, okay, that's
I've
okay.
come up with a theme, and
Right.
I've also literally put it on the schedule 4 times. It may or may not magically get erased, but no. I want to specifically dive into that vertical on the maintenance side. I feel like lots of times we talk about SCADA upward. We're going to talk about digital transformation. I want to talk about the tools. I want to talk about the techniques. I want to maybe have Vlad and I go share some like absolute complete horror stories of what happens when you don't do proper maintenance on equipment. And then we can go talk about how do we go figure out what maintenance on equipment, etc., need to happen. We will have a systems integration theme. We'll talk everything about artificial intelligence, and hopefully by about midway through the year, we know what that theme means. All we know at the moment is that we want to go have these conversations with different people. We're going to do a operational excellence theme, a data focused or data manufacturing intelligence focused theme, a systems architecture and design theme, which is still a bit TBD. I probably have to do some work to go confirm what that arc is going to look like for you guys. And then we'll have one robotics theme. Again, I feel like there are a couple of these that we could do multiple times, but my commitment is I want to go have, again, 8 to 9 of these themes over the course of the year, and we want to make them as best as we possibly can for you guys. And then again, in between those, we're going to do some trade shows. We're going to do some other things. Vlad, do you want to talk about the short trade show list that we are currently looking at, or is currently
Yeah.
very lightly penciled in the calendar?
Yeah, so to the previous point, right? So I think we want to make the trade show experience count, right? And ultimately, Dave and I have committed to not attending all of them because there's certainly enough to fill the entire 52 weeks in terms of trade shows. So we had to be very selective on, if it's obviously related to manufacturing, industrial automation, the type of work that we're doing, if there's opportunities to maybe speak at some of those events and ultimately reconnect with the community, the people we're doing work with throughout the year. And if there's an interesting, I guess, way to also organize some of the conversations that we're doing either on the podcast, but also about the work. So the current list, right? So none of these, I want to say, are completely set in stone. Obviously, we have a preference for some versus the others. I would also say that if you have some interesting trade shows that we've missed, open to have a conversation, but ultimately it needs to align and make sense for Dave and I and the format that we're proposing to have. So a couple of I guess big names. So the Prove It conference, it's coming up in February. We're
Mhm.
in discussions, with the main team to see if we can do something live together with them. There's also Automate, and these are in not in a chronological order. I think we have a different spreadsheet which shows them, but it should be simple enough to find. Hanover Messe in Germany. You've got ICC. You have Realize Live, which is a Siemens trade show out of Vegas, and then you have SPS. And I think there's a couple more maybe that we had listed on the spreadsheet, but ultimately those are the main show that Dave and I are targeting. I think they overall fit in the core audience that we're looking to reach. They also present some interesting opportunities to have conversations, and hopefully we can get some alignment with the various groups, right? Like depending on who's organizing and who's presenting or sponsoring some of those trade shows, we're looking for opportunities to work together with them again to educate the grand community of manufacturing and industrial automation.
Absolutely. So I'm excited about that. We're going to do some number of those together. And then I think that, I don't know, I will probably go look for a smaller show or maybe a couple of smaller shows to go attend. As to if we bring you guys there or not, I don't know. But I will. I'm always excited, interested in some of those smaller kind of smart manufacturing shows that I see floating around. And I feel like 2025 very well might be the year that I finally make it to one. I don't know. We'll
Oh
have to
yeah,
see how.
yeah. I was going to
But
mention. Speaking of smaller shows, right? I think there's been a increased number of those, right? So I plan on attending OT SCADACon as well as Traceroute Con if it does happen. I think it's still TBD. And then there's always, I think, interesting smaller shows by community members. I know that this year we were in discussions with Davide, right, who came on the podcast as well. He hosted his own show. I believe it was Automation Stars of Texas. I believe that was the highlight name.
well,
Yeah.
I think that that was like a actual trade show in Dallas versus kind of smaller cons, if you will, of come do some learning, get together, do some networking. I think the Texas Automation Stars was a in a major building, kind of open to the public sort of thing.
Gotcha. Well, in any case, I guess we're not gonna get into a debate of the size. I think it's a question of interesting shows and what kind of an atmosphere they offer. I think we've also talked a little bit in the background with around some more executive type shows. I think we've talked about the ISA shows, the the SESME conference and the CSIA, was it? So there's a couple of interesting shows that we're looking to definitely attend, but none of it I would say is finalized. But if anyone wants to have a conversation around that, then more than happy to do so.
Absolutely. So if we are missing anything, you guys let us know. Yeah, if we're missing anything, you guys let us know. Vlad, do we want to go jump to plans for 2025?
Let's do it. Am I kicking off?
Absolutely. You're first
All
on the
right.
list.
Sweet. So, plans for 2025, I think I've already talked about some of the changes that happened mid to late 2024. So, for me, my main focus is going to be as follows. So, number one, Solos PLC continues to operate. We are building more courses, we are reaching out to more enterprise customers. So, Solos PLC continues to grow. I think it's a really good operational company. I don't think it presents a whole lot of complexity besides, again, just reaching a larger audience. Well, I mean, it's not a technical play, right? There's just a I need to build more content, more educational materials. There's no technical uncertainty. Let's put it that way. Um, Manufacturing hub content slash in person shows. I think we've covered most of it. What I am doing in terms of content and in person shows, I think what I've realized over the years is that, and this is also in conversations again with some of the sponsors that we've had, is you can deliver a message of different nature and the medium through which you deliver it matters, right? What I mean by that is, let's say that Dave and I have these conversations. Well, we can't always dive deeper into, let's say, the technical architecture. And I think we've done an episode where we used Miro boards, to explain some of the bottlenecks. But ultimately, my goal in 2025 is to create some more content that might be, not necessarily more technical in nature, but is more of a deeper dive. So I personally like whiteboarding quite a bit when I talk with, engineering managers, engineering directors, plant managers, etc. So I will be doing some more, let's say, explainer videos in 2025 of similar nature. And I think it is very difficult to do it in just a conversation format, which ultimately means that they don't translate well into podcast form, right? So they're going to be more like whiteboarding and presenting. So they're only going to live in video type of format. But similarly, I also enjoy writing content quite a bit, and I've done so for Solus PLC, EE Enthusiast, and Kerno. So I will still be doing a lot of writing type of content, which will be released on LinkedIn, but obviously Solos PLC, Manufacturing Hub, and Joltek, depending on where it fits, right? And I made the comment earlier about cybersecurity, so I'll be, making some posts on that topic, referencing the conversation we've had with Jason. So that's a huge plan for me in terms of content, maybe for 2025. Next, we have Joltek. So Joltek is essentially my own consultancy, where the goal is to, I guess, be an umbrella of different services that I'm looking to offer, but ultimately it is the continuation of upskilling or training that is going to be in person versus, what Solus PLC has been, that is online. So I've already made a post which was released earlier today with the general technical, I want to say, outline of what the material or the hardware is going to look like. So bringing the technical training or upskilling module to in-person companies or manufacturers to help them train engineers and or technicians. And I think the natural follow-up from that is consulting, and that could be in the area of industrial automation, but ultimately also on the sort of strategy and business side. Again, I'm not going to get into a whole lot of details, but ultimately, one of the reasons why I was pulled back into manufacturing is because I think there's tons of opportunities on the data side. There's tons of opportunities, as Dave mentioned, in change management. And I think that not all problems are technical. So I think it's good to upskill the people, it's good to automate the facility, but I think there's certainly a lack of making sure that those systems work as they should. So again, the umbrella of Joltek is training and upskilling, consulting, and industrial automation.
It's a big umbrella, Vlad. But no, I'm excited that you are going to do some of the in person training. I think I have said for nearly as long as I've known you that I love what you are doing on the Solus side, but I feel like there has to be an opportunity to do some more of that in person. And so I am excited to see where that goes and where it takes you. I know that you made that post. I know you've been working on some kits of going and giving people some hands-on experience. So I am always enamored with the different kits of the PLC training, right? So what you're building, and I've got an idea of what that looks like, is different from what like a Tim Wilborn is built, which is different from like a whole bunch of the other kits and things that we've seen. And so I think it's interesting. And then kind of the different levels of groups. Like Tim is very much on the technician side, and kind of where you are, and some of the other folks, Frank Lamb included, that we've seen and had on here who are doing the training, or different types of training. I think that there is certainly a significant amount of need for training and for training at facilities. We won't say who, but earlier this year at a show, I was caught with like 3 or 4, well, you and like 2 or 3 other people that do a lot of training, with a OEM who was talking about how they're in desperate need of finding people to go train Studio 5000 or whatever it is on site. And like they would go hire 100 weeks of training between like the group of you guys, if you guys could go ahead and commit to that. So I think that is that's got to be like a net positive for the industry, because again, I think the training and upskilling is super important and super necessary. So having said that, on my side, I'm super excited for 2025. I've got a new website that is in process and will come hopefully before the end of the year, if not the end of this year, the beginning of next year. With
Who's
that kind
building
of
the
talk,
website? You're building the website?
me, Vlad, I'm building the website. That is why
Nice.
it will hopefully be up and running by the end of the year. We are taking the next couple of weeks of Manufacturing Hub off, and I will devote some untold amount of time to that, to going and do some of this build and rebuild and launch. I will say for myself, so I've run Kaplan for 5.5 years at this point. And at the beginning, it was a broad focus of we'll go do all of these things. And over the last probably 2.5 years, I feel like it's been more and more narrow and more specific as to the offerings. And I plan to continue kind of that narrowing and specificity of what works versus what doesn't work. I guess in broad terms, I feel like the more work you do, the more you understand what a good job versus what a not good job looks like. And I've certainly done enough, especially in the last, I don't know, decade across a bunch of companies, of work that made some money but was a whole lot of stress, and then maybe didn't end up making money on the back end, to be more specific and more particular on to be more specific and more particular on the jobs that make sense. And again, as I said earlier, I think it's the operations engineering services that lead into development opportunities that lead into more operations and engineering services. And so as part of what I'm planning to do in 2025, I'm going to continue to grow the ignition practice. We will still do some just straight development for some clients. We've got a couple of legacy clients that we just offer development services for. We'll still continue to offer development services if that is what you guys would like. But again, the major focus is going to be on those actionable solutions. And as part of growing and building that, if you guys have been watching when we were at ICC, we talked a bunch about Ignition 8.3. I've got a new Ignition framework that will launch probably the end of Q1 on what will be 8.3. And we have our first 8.3 project that we're going to run, assuming that the 8.3 drops into beta, when we assume 8.3 is going to drop into beta and then goes live in launch, probably, hopefully end of February, beginning of March, that'll be live. We'll have the framework up and running by that point. And my hope is we'll be able to go ahead and share more of what we're building and why we're building and how we're building it with that first client that we have, and that first project that we have on it. And then I would say beyond the ignition, we're working with a number of much larger projects. So as I said in the beginning, I find that there are more and more groups who are looking at automation for the first time, or are looking at automation and don't have that technical background. And so we've got a number of groups that we're working with that is starting more on the strategy side of what is automation, what automation do we need, and the automation that leads into the operational excellence to make sure that we can continue to increase the throughput and increase the turns that an organization has, as opposed to just putting some automation in there and then being done with that scope of work. So that is very much kind of the goal and the focus of what I see 2025 to look like on our side.
Awesome. I think that makes a lot of sense, and it sounds like we certainly have quite a bit of overlap within some of our goals.
Absolutely. So I will say we've got a question on YouTube here from one of our listeners talking about a wireless temperature sensors for pipes. I feel like this is the opportunity that we can go ahead and drop it in here. So they're talking about currently trying to come up with a solution to integrate like BACnet or Modbus, and then like for LoRaN, temp sensor to BACnet gateway here. So I said that I have seen and used a bunch of Banner Engineering, but those are typically more expensive than the LoRaN that I have seen and used in the past. But yeah, so IFM certainly has some similar experiences. Vlad, do you have any experience with LoRaN to like BACnet or Modbus gateways?
I do not.
Okay. I don't typically do LoRaN. The little bit I've done is on a completely different like SaaS style application, but I never bought any of the devices. We were using those specifically because they were like extremely inexpensive. So I don't have any specific experience on the different like LoRaN to BACnet Modbus gateways. But no, I do not have any of that experience. If anyone in the chat has some, please feel free to go ahead and drop it in the chat for us. Otherwise, you will have to let us know how that goes and how that is working for you. But
Yeah, as
talking
far as
about
I'm
work,
concerned, I
go
was
ahead,
gonna
go ahead.
say I think like those are more IoT type of networks, right? I think like LoRaWAN is used if you want to automate or do some home automation type of projects, but typically that doesn't really even go into a Modbus gateway. Usually, it just goes to a I guess a receiver which you can put into your like Raspberry Pi or Linux box and
Mhm.
receive the signal. But I think it's just like low payloads. Maybe you can see that in the oil fields for some reason, but I've not really done work on that type of equipment.
So I've not seen them in the oil fields. I've seen them in the greenhouse application that I've talked about in the
Okay.
past, and that was very specifically because they were inexpensive, right? So you could buy 4 or 5 sensors and a gateway from China for like $300 to $500, and so because some of these groups are super cost conscious, that is the direction we went. If the group has more money and is looking for more of an industrial solution, I would look at spending a bit more money on something that you don't have to go find an additional gateway for. On the LoRaNs, it was mostly we took it into a receiver, and that receiver slash gateway we just plugged into a computer. And again, I don't know how complex the facility is, and if like going and networking a whole bunch of those is reasonable, or what it looks like. It may be you're looking to go measure 2 pipes, and that could be easy. But if you're looking to go measure, 1,000 pipes, that could be more difficult. There was one application that I looked at and specced out a whole bunch of years ago, Vlad, in which we were measuring pipes, but it was oil, right? So we wanted to go measure oil temperature for, I think they were like CNCs and injection molding machines. And the premise or the concept was there's that kind of like golden band, And if we can keep the temperature within that, we get the best parts out. But as soon as it goes too high, the quality starts dropping significantly. Alas, that was kind of a guesstimate. There was no like legitimate temperature monitoring on any of these machines, right? This was probably 7 or 8 years ago. I went to go look at it, and yeah, this was probably 7 or 8 years ago. I went to go look at it, and these machines were probably 80s through like early to mid 2010s. So they were significantly older machines without any of the additional temperature sensors. And so I certainly do see a lot of that kind of very baseline automation necessary for digital transformation for a lot of these projects. Again, as I talked about, like lots of these groups that don't have automation, lots of these groups that are going through automation have still very much skipped a large part of the adding sensors of Industry 3.0 before they want to go make that next market jump. And I know Vlad and I have hugely varying different thoughts on the best correct ways to go ahead and go add those sensors. Vlad, I don't want to go talk about that right now. I do want to talk about technology. So you've bought some, are working on some fun different technology this year. I don't think we've talked about like the 4,000 servers that are keeping your office warm in the winter and very warm in the summer. I'm working on some different things. What are you working on? What pieces of kind of technology excite you? How are you using them, and all of those things?
Yeah, so a couple of things, right? So again, going back to what I've gone through a couple of months ago is, transitioning from the IT side into OT, but ultimately, the knowledge that I've gained in IT is extremely helpful. So what I've done earlier this year, right, is I've purchased a couple of servers, right? One is just a tower PC that I've assembled myself, and the
Mhm.
other one is a rack-mounted Dell server that you typically find in a data center, right? And I've, to be honest with you, I recommend anyone who's interested in computers and servers wants to host stuff on their own, whether that's video games or a multimedia like Plex or Jellyfin server, or just run even home automation apps or industrial apps. I think it was a very good learning experience. I started a post which got to 3,000 words, and then I had so many images. I just kind of, it fell under the I guess the number of other items I was working on. So I never finished the experience of, I guess, buying a server. But ultimately, I've learned a ton. You know what I mean? Like from being worried to the server showing up with absolutely me not being able to power it on to the point where I'm looking up graphics cards that I can, you know, put into the server in a way that is unorthodox because the size of the graphics card doesn't fit. So you have like these extension kits and all sorts of different modifications. I would say that it's definitely easy, I think, to overspend in these projects, but ultimately, if you do a little bit of research, which again, you're, I think, like bound to fall into some of the traps that I've
Mhm.
myself like fallen into, then you can get these relatively cheap. What usually happens in a data center or in a large enterprise company is these servers will get recycled anywhere from 6 to 10 years, right? So a server
Mhm.
that is 6 years old is just going to be put essentially for scrap value to a company, and typically those companies will purchase all of those racks. They will of course destroy the hard drives or wipe the hard drives clean so that there's no data being stolen or taken by a different entity, and they will put them on different websites. And at that point, again, I don't know if they sell them in bulk. I don't know if some of them take them and put them on eBay on their own. But ultimately, you can go on eBay, or you can go. There's even websites that will, list out if this is a good deal based on the RAM, the performance, the model. You can very easily buy a very good server, right, by today's metrics for anywhere between 500 and $800, right? And this is, we're talking about very large, like 2U rack mounted server. I
Yeah.
can't really like bring it over. It's fairly heavy, right? It shows up
Yeah.
in this massive box. But ultimately, going back to what has that allowed me to do besides, like I said, learn virtualization, learn containerization, learn how to, I guess, work with hardware, but also with software that lives on a server specifically. I've launched a number of applications which go from clustering those containers, but ultimately deploying some, I want to say, industrial applications on top of them. And this is from the basics like the IDEs for Studio 5000 or TIA Portal to like data aggregators, Node-RED, HiByte. And I'm still experimenting with them. I haven't had, enough time to essentially run every single tool on the server, but I do plan to, deploy Litmus, play around with Tulip interfaces, play around with Canary, play around with HiveMQ, right? So there's a lot of tools that you can get a trial license for, including, even Ignition, and you should be able to see, store, and ultimately process some of the data that you have, I guess, generated by the devices that you see behind me, but ultimately running to a server that is a typical environment that you would find in a factory. And I think there's a couple of, obviously, like, you learn, but you also save quite a bit of money instead of using some of the cloud tools. Of course, you're not going to have the AWS or Azure or GCP, AI or ML proprietary capabilities, but you can do quite a bit with a server. You can do a lot of open source type of application development. And so I think it offers a lot of possibility for anyone looking to just tinker around, but ultimately work on projects. So I think that's the main idea that I'm working on, and I'm working on some data applications and just in discussions for some interesting opportunities. And I saw that you put Mac on my list as well, so I recently purchased one of those Mac Minis. I had a MacBook Pro back in 2016, which has served me well for some Swift iOS development, but ultimately I've not really experienced the new silicone, how would you call them, the M1, M2, M3s, and M4s. So
Yeah.
I'm curious to see what the hype is all about, and I will be using those for a couple of projects that I have in parallel to all of this.
Absolutely. No, so I was very excited to go watch you go through your massive server builds. Um, yeah, I've been very excited to see how that's going. I've been interested on the background to see how some of the normal softwares that we would go install did or did not work on some of the server builds and other things that you've done, and some different VMs and some different other solutions that you have gone to build. I certainly think that there's a lot of opportunity, especially if you want some of those older servers. I mean, older by IT standards, if we're getting rid of them every 3 to 5 years, sort of standards. There's lots of opportunities. There's a huge amount of market when it comes to that, and so I've been happy to watch you go through it, and perhaps not have to go through it myself, Vlad. But no, so I would say on my side, I've bought a bunch of technology, in part to go keep data closer, and to go have some more backups. So I purchased a Synology NAS. Couple of weeks ago. I was waiting for a Black Friday sale. The Black Friday sales didn't get quite as good as I had hoped. And so I've got one floating with like 48 terabytes of backup hard drive space in it currently, to go ahead and do some mostly home and other backup things on that. I like it because there's some upgradable functionality, but I don't think we'll need very much of it at the moment. And then I would say I also, within the last, I don't know, couple of months, I purchased a 3D printer. I've been very enamored by the technology, right? And I feel like we've talked about 3D printing on the show a number of times, but for me it was very tinker heavy, right? And I feel like historically on 3D printing it's been very tinker heavy, and there's a bunch of steps on the calibration side. There's a bunch of steps on the, hey, if you have this issue you have to do this, and it may take it may take weeks of time to go print the parts that you need and get it calibrated and get it up and running, to the point of being successful. And so I wanted to go purchase one of the newer iterations of those, because on my side, I was very interested to kind of go answer the question of how close to like a very consumer friendly technology do we have, right? And so
Remind
for
me
my
which model it is, Dave. Sorry.
so I have the Bamboo Labs A1. And so for me, it's the, hey, we can go print a bunch of things. I've been actually really surprised and pleased on what we can go kind of like, they call it print in place. So print in one part. We printed some of these like infinity spinners. which has been a huge hit with everyone who's gotten one of them. But from my side, it was very much how far can one go push the limits of that. And from my perspective, it's very much the what sort of applications can be used in an industrial setting. From my perspective, I don't own anything that can go print like Metal Gears, right? So I'm not suggesting we go print Metal Gears to go replace them inside of machines. But I do a bunch of work with different facilities that there's like lots of different setups. And so I think the question is, hey, can we go print a series of, setup blocks, and can we go make them, I don't know, 2 inches long or 8 inches long, or however we need to go run this particular set of setup, as opposed to going through, from my perspective, like the historical process of, okay, go ask the maintenance folks, and then it's a week or 2 weeks, and then it's just kind of an extended process, especially with most of the projects I do with these groups. It's the, hey, we need to do this in addition to the, 50 hours of work that we already have. So lots of times those are a bit difficult to go get some of those additional things through, regardless of the value that it goes to bring the end user. So from my perspective, it's what can we do to go print some of these things? Are we to the point of it's capable? And to that point is, are we to the point that you don't have to have someone who's tinkering on it, right? Like, are we to the point of, hey, we're going to go put this in the lab, in the R&D, in the maintenance shop, and if someone needs something, they can go check to make sure that the printer is open. We've already got all of the setup blocks or whatever it is saved. They can go, press a couple of buttons on their app. They can go press a couple of buttons on the computer, and we can go print another one. And to that point, it's very much have we gotten to the point of, hey, if we've run out of, for 3D printers, they use filament. If we've run out of filament, can we go through the process, and is it as easy or similarly easy to go ahead and go pull out the old spool and put in a new spool similar to what we are using in like a typical 2D printer, an inkjet printer, or other things like that. I've honestly been pleasantly surprised. It works as well, if not better, than I could ever hope for. And I don't know. I guess the follow-on answer is I don't know how close to 100% prime time ready it is. I think on the operational side, I think on the setup side, I think on knobs and other things, absolutely. Again, I wouldn't suggest that we go print new gears. And so I think that it's certainly a step forward. I don't have, 6 figures invested in metal 3D printing equipment. So I couldn't tell you how close to, hey, we have this problem. Can we go mock up a solution and go print this solution and be back up and running in some number of hours? That I don't know, but I am very impressed on the kind of operational side, on the everything else side. So that is my early thoughts on that. I'm sure I'll have more thoughts as we continue through the year, and as I hopefully get some other opportunities to go use and build this. And then I would say beyond that, I have done some upgrading on technology as well. Before Vlad bought his new Mac Mini, I got a new MacBook Pro M4. My previous one is 5 years
M4,
old, 6 years
oh,
old.
I think they updated the MacBook Pros before, right? The Mac Minis? Yeah, Mac Mini just got announced, I think, 2 weeks ago.
They announced them the same week.
They did?
So I've had this for about a month at this point. So I've had it for about a month, and it's great. It's significantly faster, as I was telling Vlad a couple of days or a couple of weeks ago. It's significantly faster on a lot of the operations. It no longer makes weird grinding noises when the fans spin up, which is always an awesome thing. And 3, I forgot what it's like actually across most of my devices to have devices that have battery. I feel like the last laptop that is now, again, like nearly 6 years old at this point was what I feel like it worked well, but it had to be plugged in. And I have been on 2 hours of video conference today, and I am still at 70% of this. So I have been very impressed by a lot of the things when it comes to that. Similarly to when I upgraded a phone earlier in the year from a 3 or 4 year old phone, I forgot what it was like to have battery life and to have a phone that could go last certainly the whole day if it's just floating around in my pocket for most of it. I forgot what it was like, and battery life is nice, Vlad. I don't know why I forgot about it in the last, I don't know, 3 or 4 years, but having battery life is very nice.
Absolutely. Let's I guess let's wrap up with some of the final questions, right? So I can start maybe by asking you, Dave, what do you have in store for 2025 in terms of predicting the future? What do you think is going to change, stay the same, or maybe be different?
Absolutely. I would say with like the oncoming tariffs that there's a lot of questions, right? Or the alleged oncoming tariffs, there's a lot of
Which
questions.
tariffs? Canada?
The worldwide tariffs from the US to Canada and China and whomever
Okay.
else depending
Yep.
upon the day of the week. I certainly have clients who are looking at it as, hey, if this happens, what does it mean for us? Are prices going to go up? What components are going to go up? What does that look like? So I think that certainly bodes to being said that adds to some uncertainty. But again, kind of the theme that I have seen is I think we're going to see more and more groups be forced into some amount of automation due to labor costs, due to the lack of labor, due to the need, hopefully, to go make and manufacture more things here in North America. So I think we're going to see a lot more groups seriously having these conversations and investing in automation who historically we have not seen a ton of automation from.
Yeah, I would agree with a lot of that. I think it's going to be interesting. Like to me, I guess living currently in Canada, if the tariffs do pass, which again, I looked at the historical, not necessarily threats, but negotiations on that side, and I think a lot of times they were announced and then they were just used as a lever to negotiate certain agreements.
Mhm.
But if they were to pass, I think it's an immediate, at least in the Canadian market, increase of prices by nearly the same percentage, right? So
Yeah.
if the tariffs are, I think they were discussing like 25 or 30%, if I'm not mistaken. So if that happens, a lot of our imports or I guess products here in Canada that come from the US side, so it will just be an increase of that exact price or passed on to the consumer, so to speak. But for me, look, predict the future. I think that the whole AI movement is very interesting, right? And I didn't comment on your, I guess, comment earlier so that I could maybe predict the future using AI. I think that there's a lot of capital going into a lot of different companies, not only AI, but also in our space, right? In manufacturing, OT, data, et cetera, to figure out the gains that can be had in the space. I've said it to many people and I'll say it again. I think that if you come in with a pure IT or software background, I think that you will very quickly realize that things are not just done architecturally differently on the OT side, but they're also different in terms of relationships, change management, and so there's a lot of I think there's a lot of thoughts by different groups going into our space, and a lot of capital is being invested that they will magically come in with an AI idea that is rooted in software that will change manufacturing, right? Right, whether that's predictive maintenance, whether that's simulations, whether that's processing data on the cloud. I think that there's going to be a ton of failures, right? Like I'm
Oh, yeah.
actually, but I'm looking forward to that because I think, and I made this comment about humanoid robotics, right? Even though I think that the idea, in a general sense, just doesn't align with the financials and the technology. I think it ultimately it paves the way for changes, right? So the more money is poured into manufacturing and people trying things and developing different ideas, even if the idea fails, I think that to some extent the IP and the learnings and at least some of the people will uh, push the industry forward, and if nothing else, apply pressure to the current, I want to say, biggest OEMs in our space, right? To make some change, right? If you start eating up market share, even if you fail, they are bound to notice what you are doing. So I think like next year, that's what we're going to see. We're going to see a ton of failures in these spaces because I think the investments are fairly recent. They either came in last year or they came in this year. So I think
Mhm.
that companies will start running out of capital, at least from those rounds in 2025. And I don't know if the C side is going to be more conservative because of the results of the election, or less conservative because we have more certainty at least for the next 4 years. So we'll see if more capital continues to get injected. But I made a post also on the A16Z, Andrew Horowitz, right? Like they made a full podcast on how manufacturing that has a lot of opportunity, but ultimately they even say it themselves, you need people with a very deep OT background to help these companies because otherwise they simply don't know how things are done. So that is
Absolutely,
my
I
take.
agree, and to your point, also agree that I think it'll be interesting to see funding. Right, I think this year was more difficult for funding than the previous year, and that year was more difficult for funding than the year before. So I think it will be interesting to see. And you and I have had this discussion a number of times. We don't have to go rehash it as to which groups find money, which groups fold, which groups go in what direction. I think we'll certainly see a lot more groups that have run out of runway and end up folding. And that is just kind of the normal in this space. But hopefully, from those, we'll see new, fun, interesting ideas that do go make a difference. Vlad, we want to go ask you for some career advice. What is the best piece of career advice you have for folks at the end of 2024?
I would say for me, a big career advice that I have not necessarily shared yet is trust your instincts, right? So I think that a lot of times we have periods either of, maybe growth, maybe doubt, where something tells us, hey, like this is not right maybe for me, or maybe this is right for me, and somebody tells you the opposite, right? They're gonna either try to convince you that the grass is greener on the other side, or vice versa, try to convince you that this is not a good opportunity for you. And I think that you need to learn to have a gut feeling for these things, right? And that could be, again, on the personal level, on the technical level, maybe based on what you want to do, instead of getting convinced by others what you should or should not be doing. So trust your instincts.
I think that's good.
What have you got?
I think that is good, especially your first instincts, right? I find that especially your first instincts, or perhaps someone's outside instincts, are sometimes better, because sometimes you just walk yourself into a position of, I feel like this is my only way through. So I would completely agree with that. I have, I think, two pieces of advice for folks. I feel like it's probably important this time of year for both of them, right? So, one, I'm going to mirror a similar conversation that Vlad and I had a month or a couple of months ago, when we were talking about businesses and starting a business. I feel like this is the time of year when people kind of sit back and do some thinking and kind of figure out what they want to do, right? Like maybe it's year end bonuses, or maybe we're closing the year and you get the bonus at the end of the first quarter, and there's kind of a lot of moving parts in play. As someone who has run their own company for 5.5 years at this point, I would strongly suggest not to starting your own business. And Vlad and I both agree on this piece of advice. And I think Vlad made a bunch of really compelling points at the front end of how difficult it is, right? Like you have to know a whole bunch of things, especially if you're a super technical person and you are looking to grow and start a company, right? Like if you're a really good controls engineer and you just want to do work at a couple of local facilities and you know those facilities and you don't want to grow and start a team, yes, it is theoretical that you can go make some more money from that. But at some point you walk yourself into a management non-technical role. At some point you do all of this. At some point you have to go learn how to sell. It is a wild learning curve if you have not been intimately involved in kind of all of those. And my second piece of advice that I feel kind of mirrors a really good conversation that we had with Kent last week is, don't be afraid to stand out. right? To a large extent, there are a whole bunch of people within your organization, or there's a whole bunch of consultants within your industry, or there's a whole bunch of robotics programmers or technicians or whatever that have a very similar skill set. At the end of the day, there needs to be some sort of human connection from one group to another group in order to go set you apart. I think Kent shared that it was his singing. I wouldn't necessarily suggest that you sing in front of unintentionally an entire group of executives, but it helps set him apart and kind of move him in the direction of people got to know him. So go find something to help people get to know you as you're going through this process.
Mhm.
Vlad, we like to ask for some book and content recommendations. You have a couple of like super legitimate ones. I have at least one absolutely trash recommendation. What do you have?
So a couple of things, right? So earlier this week, I believe on Monday, the book by Cody Sanchez, which is called Main Street Millionaire, was released. And to
Okay.
give you an idea, right? So I certainly had a couple of conversations in the sphere of private equity with a couple of groups, but ultimately, to paint you the picture of Main Street Millionaire is it talks about the opportunity, I guess, of acquiring businesses, not necessarily focused on, manufacturing or industrial automation, but it paints a picture of you can get somewhere by ultimately acquiring businesses that are obviously good, but ultimately the person who owns that business does not necessarily have a successor, right? I think we live in an era where a lot of boomers are looking to transition baby boomers out of the different businesses they have built. So there's an opportunity for private equity at different stages, right? And the book breaks it down in terms of smaller opportunities, medium-sized opportunities, and a very large opportunities in which typically firms would come in and buy those businesses. But ultimately, this talks about, how to find the right business for you to buy. It talks about some of the financials, what to look out for. And I've always been interested in those types of thoughts, ideas, and conversations. So for me, it's a learning experience if nothing else. But ultimately, I've also had experiences where myself and a couple of other individuals were looking into purchasing something tangible, and like I said, I definitely see an opportunity of doing that in the future. So if you're interested in that type of content, Main Street Millionaire by Cody Sanchez released earlier this week. And then the second one, I may have already mentioned this, but at least Dave, you know that I listen to the podcast called My First Million by Sean Purry and Sam Parr. And you can probably sense there's a theme here between the two things that I'm recommending. But ultimately, there's a lot to operating a business. I think it's a very good idea to learn from others who have been before you, and it is no easy endeavor, but ultimately good resources and good people and good explanations that you can listen to are always a huge plus. So that's how I've been spending my time on some podcasts and books. And it isn't, I get the audiobooks on Audible versus the paper copy. So I don't know if it's different or the same, but I would assume it's the same.
Absolutely. Have you read the one that came out earlier this week, The Main Street Millionaire?
I am about halfway in on that
Okay.
book. Yeah. So it's
Interesting.
like I said, like everything that I've mentioned is from what I listened in that book.
Okay, absolutely. No, I think that I think that that is interesting. I will strongly consider going and picking up one or a couple of those, depending upon how much legitimate reading I am going to get into at the end of the year. So I would say kind of a couple of things from my perspective. One of the real kind of businessy books I'm in is I found an old version of the Toyota production system handbook that has been probably out of print since the 80s or mid 80s to mid 90s. And so I am in process of going through that. I find all of those super interesting. To some extent they're all the same, to some extent there are some differences in there. I like the different kind of conversation styles, and as we go through the process of sharing stories, right? So I think the stories and applications are very interesting from my perspective. I would say, well, as Vlad knows, because I tell Vlad when I go do vacation type things, as I will towards the end of the year, I want to go read absolutely nothing that has to do with business, and it's just like a bunch of abominable trash. And when Vlad's like, "Oh, what'd you do?" I'm like, "I read 4,000 pages of trash, Vlad, on my Libby book application." And so, from my perspective, I think there are a couple of Michael Connelly books that I will see if I can download and read. He historically writes a whole bunch of characters, including the Bosch series that Amazon has picked up for I don't know, 8 years, 10 years at this point. And he also wrote the Lincoln Lawyer that is Netflix has picked up, and was a Matthew McConaughey movie. Before that, and maybe something else after that. So he writes both of those. I'm sure I'm going to go find some of that. And then I feel like it is the end of the year. So I'm going to go talk about my most favorite business podcast that I like to listen to. I like to listen to Cortex, which has changed kind of throughout the years. But it's by a guy named Mike and Gray. And they originally came in talking about their separate businesses, and Mike does podcasts and Gray has historically done YouTube videos, and they built a business out of that, and they've sold some products. And so I like listening to them sell products. They came up with the yearly themes. And so for them, the yearly themes is very much kind of a strong reflection of what they did the previous year, but also a series of goals and how they plan to go meet those goals for the next year, which I always find is an important and generally very healthy part of what I attempt to do. Less so in relation to like specific business planning, which is also important, but more so in relation to kind of larger things. And I think the value that I like what they talk about is a combination of both work and life, as opposed to just we have to go hit this sales number and we need to go hit these marketing impressions and we have to go do all of these other things throughout the course of the year. So those are the recommendations that I have for you guys at the end of the year. Vlad, last question for you. How can our listeners help? Who should reach out? Who do you want to connect with?
Absolutely. So I would say, in a general sense, everybody working in manufacturing or interested in manufacturing is welcome to reach out to me. I want to say, in a more specific sense, obviously you can find me on Solos PLC, Manufacturing Hub, and Joltek. And ultimately, I'm looking for consulting opportunities, upskilling opportunities, and systems integration, right? So all of that work, I think, falls under a very large umbrella, as you've mentioned. But ultimately, like I said, if you're doing anything in manufacturing and you have a moment or interested in speaking with me, I think that would be great.
Absolutely. No, I think that's fantastic. And to some extent, I'm going to parallel what you were saying of if you guys like to hang out with Vlad and I, and we're not connected, I don't know why we're not connected. So please feel free to go ahead and drop me a connection request. Please feel free to say hi. A couple of times a week, I get a request with people saying, hey, they listen to the podcast and it's awesome. And probably more often than that when we're walking around the show floor, which is always amazing. So if you guys like to listen to this, please feel free to go ahead and drop me a connection request and say hi. I would say if you guys are in the process of looking at automation for the first time to try to understand what automation looks like versus what it means for operations versus what it means for projects, I would love to go talk to you guys on that side. If you guys are deep in the ignition side and are looking for help and support, or help and support and understanding data and going through the process of actually making that data and that information meaningful so that you can run more turns and have more throughput or make more cases or whatever the term is you're looking for, please feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to go ahead and have those conversations. Vlad, I think we have talked everyone's ears off. We have had the same like half a dozen people hanging out with us on YouTube the entire time this time, and the same handful of people watching us on LinkedIn. So everyone, thank you guys so much. It has been an awesome year. A bit of housekeeping, as Vlad and I said earlier today, we'll have a couple of episodes that'll go out on tape delay over the period of time while we are not here live for you guys. We are off until January 8th is, I believe, when we will have our 2025 kickoff show, which should be a lot of fun. If you guys have made it this far, again, please connect with Vlad and myself. Make sure you're following Manufacturing Hub on LinkedIn, on YouTube, on all of those other places. If you have made it this far on podcast format, you are freaking amazing. Thank you so much for that. Rate us 5 stars, follow along, subscribe, go share, go do all of those things that when I remember to ask you guys, do and give us better metrics and all of those other amazing things. Until next year.